Good morning, General Komar, sir, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Colonel Mike Runey, the Chief of Joint Army Concepts. I know folks are starting to come back in. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. Really want to take the next 45 minutes up to an hour to talk about and present the overview of the .7 release of multi-domain battle and really walk you through the concepts, the feedback, and we appreciate many of you providing feedback on the 0.5, which came out in April, May, in time for Unified Quest, and then the .6, which came out right after the 4th of July weekend. The overwhelming feedback to us was that it was continuing to improve, but this was also not just a concept, but a concept of concepts, that there were multiple concepts embedded inside of multi-domain battle as it's being developed. And it's one of the reasons that from the community of practice, specifically the COEs, that we received the feedback to come back and start to step that out for them. So what you're going to receive today is a walkthrough graphically of the .7 and as you would read it. And so I know many of you have already looked at it, some of you haven't, but this is to orient you to it, the big ideas, and then to, again, answer any questions that you may have relevant to that. So just to give you, before we head in, there were timelines that we're on with the concept and where we think we're going. The first is this, the .7 went out to the general officer community for their review and chop last Friday. General Odom sent it out. At the 06 level, we started to put it out on Monday to make sure that we gave the general officers some time to work that over the weekend as they saw fit. We have to have feedback from the Army side by 31, I think 1 September, so 31 August, 1 September, training holiday for the military team. We're going to consolidate that. The Marine Corps has a similar staffing process. They're going through their 3 stars right now. They'll come to us on the 5th, and the 5th through the 8th, we're going to consolidate and reconcile the key issues on the .7 and start to present that the next week to senior leadership inside of TRADOC. To make AUSA printing, General Perkins said he wants the concept printed and delivered at AUSA. We have to have it to the printer by the 15th. So that next week is really tight. So hence your comments and what we can get at between now and 15 September are key. So I just want to give you the timeline broadly on that. The second piece I want to just set context is we anticipate that there will be a next iteration over the next FY to 2 FYs on multi-domain battle. So yes, we will have a 1.0. It will have an RC list in it, required capabilities list in it, and it is conceptually coherent, we argue. Yet we will talk about at the end some of the things that are not yet or will not be inside of MDB 1.0. So if we could, I'll go to slides. Before I dive into the slides, I just want to reiterate, many of you are familiar with it, the multi-domain battle as a concept is an operational concept. It touches on the strategic, and it has tactical implications, but it's fundamentally an operational concept against a pure threat. And that is also very important. So the question we often get is it applicable? How broadly is this applicable? So I want to scope that up now. It may be applicable to other scenarios and other environments and other situations, but it's operational and pure threat focused. The other piece is that we get feedback on is this prescriptive? And we say actually it's meant to be fairly open in the sense of it's not too broad. It's a refinement of the Army operating concept in the context of a pure adversary, but it's not telling you how you're going to, for example, open a window of advantage. And so there's a lot of room for the art and science of multi-domain battle both to still develop and then also to be practiced. So if you go to the next slide. So this, I'm going to walk you through, this is really how we were looking at it, how the .7 is stepped out and laid out. And there are 3 significant changes for those of you who read the .6. The first is that Chapter 1 has been completely revised to bring forward the big ideas of multi-domain battle. And so in summary, those are the 3 components of the solution that we'll talk about in more detail, which is calibrated force posture, employ resilient formations, and converged capabilities. The 2 significant new ideas to multi-domain battle are the convergence of capabilities and the notion that we must compete below the threshold of armed conflict in ways that we haven't in the past. And so the one big challenge that starts to come out in chapter 1 is this notion of time and how we use and manage time. So 3 big ideas. The 2 in competition we introduced in chapter 1, that's new. And it's summarized in about 3 pages. The second is that we brought back from the battlefield framework from an appendix and brought it forward into chapter 2. We talked about the changing environment. And the third is we brought forward the discussion on convergence of domain windows, or windows of advantage, from an appendix into the chapter 3. So when you're looking at what's major difference, those are key differences. The other area of feedback we received from the Centers of Excellence was that point 5 was very aggressive. In some cases, it was called preemptive as they read it. It wasn't intended to be written that way, so we made a corrective in the point 6. The feedback we got was this was too, we'd erred on the other direction. And so we're using in point 7, and we need feedback on this, we've moved towards somewhere in between where instead of counter, we're contesting and challenging very actively. The other piece of context in this, and talking to the community, is that very often feedback from them is that the concepts up to this point from coming out of Arctic have largely been what's Blue able to do, and then we bring in the threat or the context. And what we're saying now is we're going to lead with the environment, and the operating environment and the threat, and then how does Blue operate within that, reseize the initiative, and achieve objectives. So there's a bit of an approach difference that I think accounts for this, but we've also changed the language. So we'll talk through this. Some of this will be familiar to you, but hopefully we'll emphasize what is mostly consistent. I would say largely you should see consistencies from point 6 to point 7. So you go to the next slide. At the beginning of the point 7, which is here, in the front cover is the logic map. This reflects the outline and the structure of the document, largely. And so if I recommend that your team print this out for you. You may have it on your left side, and as you walk through and read through, that this may prove helpful. And this is how I'm going to present it today. So if you go to the next slide, which is the operating environment, and specifically the 4 areas of why we need a new concept, I think the key one is that we acknowledge that we, the joint forces and partners, are contested in all domains. Without that acknowledgement, I would argue a fact, in the 2030 to 2050 timeframe, but specifically 2030 to 2040, you could argue there is no requirement for new concept. So, but we argue there is. On increased lethality, one of the things that the way that we present multi-domain battle is as we look at China and Russia in particular, is they have developed systems and systems of systems. This is a systems-oriented approach to peer adversaries in that time period, in a broad time frame, but the key area is their ability, and very rapidly, to increase lethality and precision in ways that we are not currently accustomed to or organized to fight and win against. Part 3, the complex environment, the so what here, I think for us is that while short of armed conflict, below armed conflict, our sensors and our communications, our networks will enable us to give us the greatest freedom of action. Once we move into armed conflict period, those sensors and those capabilities to see and act against a peer adversary in an increasingly complex battlefield will be highly degraded, if not at periods denied, and will be challenged. And so we must be able to have physical presence in contact with the enemy, whether physically, virtually, and arguably you'll see in the concept cognitively, to both sense, decide, and act in this new environment. So why does a complex environment drive us to a new concept? And the last one is that we acknowledge that our traditional forms of deterrence, which were very effective against a certain adversary in a certain environment, are no longer sufficient, because some of the actions that they're taking in terms of unconventional warfare and informational warfare are fundamentally undeterrable. And so we have to rethink how we get at that, and I'd say that the big idea here is the notion of competing. And so you'll see throughout the concept we have, so in the point 6, we talked about the competition period, we talked about the conflict period and the post-conflict period. We dropped periodization off when I think a fair critique is that we replaced the 5-phasing construct with the 3-phasing construct. And really, we want to move it to actions that we're competing below armed conflict very actively. When required, we fight and win. to return to a post-competition conflict or competition on terms favorable to friendly forces. And so I think that's important. And this notion of challenge deterrence and how we get at that is really capturing the idea of how we compete. So the 4 ways, we summarize the 4 ways the operating environment has changed. Go to the next slide. And we talk about now the 4 ways that the adversary has expanded the battlefield. And many of you are familiar with this chart. This is the chart that General Perkins used in his military review article. It's one that we've often used, and really we talk about in 4 ways. As you remember, we are the U.S. Army in particular is in our discussions with USRPAC and some of the other COEs. I mean, we understand the deep, close rear that is a legacy of our air-land battle construct has been very helpful for us, but largely because the adversary has been able to expand how they operate in terms of time, which is on the left side of this column, down into what we traditionally had called phases 1 and 2. You can see that we are not accustomed typically to work in that. We focus predominantly and historically on phases 3 and sometimes 2 to 3. In terms of domains, the cyber, space, and information information is not a domain, but an information environment has clearly changed how the adversary has looked at it. They've created systems around this. And while we have mechanisms that operate in these areas, I think the argument is that we are not as coherent in the way that the adversary has been able to operate here. Increasingly, those domains and information, as well as increasingly precision fires, are limitless in their range. And this is different. And our ability to both sense, to deal with, attack, or defend against, and then to cycle through based on capacities is going to be increasingly challenged, and not just by Russia and China, but by other adversaries. And this is different. They've expanded this in terms of range. And finally, and back into this deterrence and competition issue, is that they've expanded in terms of actors. So in a phrase, and on the logic map as you're looking at it, adversaries have expanded the battlefield in terms of time, in terms of domains, in terms of ranges and distances, and in terms of actors. And so what has that done? Well, it is a compressed, if you're an operational U.S. commander, it is compressed the battlefield. So if you're a tactical commander in what we call today the close area, it has definitely given you the effect that the adversary who can converge its capabilities basically across this whole broad rectangle that you have in front of you into the close area from all angles, that you're feeling for U.S. forces as you're compressed. You have to defend 360 degrees, potentially. You have to deal with all the domains plus information, plus EW and SEMA. If you're an operational strategic commander in the operational strategic support area, places that you traditionally built your combat power and moved it into a threatened area, you are now under potential attack, lethally or non-lethally. And so one of the things that we've looked specifically at Russia and China, and I don't know if there are any G2 reps in the room, but they've helped us develop this and we'll develop it further, is that the adversary has actually converged capabilities already, enabled in large part because of their centralized power, political military power, has enabled them to converge capabilities and employ that fairly rapidly and cohesively across this expanded battlefield, both in time and in distances. Next slide. So that's really chapter 2, and in chapter 2, we start to talk about the threat. And we talk about the threat and how the threat presents itself in the competition period, or competition, and then a conflict. And this lays out how we see the threat systems, which are represented on the left side of the chart, and how they integrate those to achieve its primary purpose in this period, and that is to separate the U.S. and its partners and allies politically. That yellow box at the bottom. That's its goal. The adversaries intend to achieve their strategic aims short of armed conflict. And the reason that we argue that U.S. forces, joint forces, partners, allies, and the interagency have to be able to compete effectively is because we have to be able to defeat this aggression below armed conflict. And so we lay these out as systems, and notice that they reinforce each other, that the reconnaissance elements, both physical and virtual, are working across the distances right now, both to gain placement and access, and to report back both for targeting and ongoing operations, non-lethal operations during this time, as well as to set the conditions if and when the adversary chooses to move to conflict, that they're ready to do so. At the same time, there are unconventional warfare elements and their ability to raise and sustain proxy forces, again, across the battlefield, but especially, again, in their near abroad, are both aimed to start to create those fractures of political instability and to set conditions to exploit those, because those actions in unconventional warfare will reinforce their information warfare narrative. And we'd argue at this point that if you looked at their main effort in this period, it's their information warfare. And all other activities are aimed at helping to be effective over time. That is all underpinned by the adversary's conventional forces. And General Odom has a way of saying that the way that the adversaries have set this up is we're one snap exercise away from a fait accompli campaign to achieve limited strategic objectives. That's the way the adversary has set that up. Whether or not they choose that strategic wise decision, it's beyond the scope of the concept. But we acknowledge that that is one of the things that militarily they're attempting to set conditions that could be an option for them. And multi-domain battle says that we have to counter that and challenge that and contest that. Next slide. So if and when the adversary chooses to go to armed conflict, that reconnaissance effort is obviously already working. And you can see that I'm now going to work from bottom to top. They've set the conditions with their unconventional warfare teams to now prosecute a very aggressive, both disruptive on the cyberspace and information side, but also a highly lethal one at ranges and places of their choosing. Again, throughout the depth of the battlefield. And this is supporting a large measure their conventional forces. So one of the key elements that we see here is that their ISR strike system is central to how they plan on isolating the joint and separating the joint force. And you can see in the yellow box, they're going to separate the joint force in at least two ways. So the U.S. traditional response is that we're going to echelon forces rapidly into theater. And so using their lethal and non-lethal capabilities, they're going to start to separate and create time separation for us and challenge the joint commander to be able to organize combat power, both lethal and non-lethal, to challenge the adversary's campaign. But they're also going to separate us tactically. And one of the ways they're going to do that, both China and Russia and possibly others, is they're going to create air superiority from the ground. This is different. This is a change that we haven't fully adapted to. I think many of us have identified this. But by able to achieve certainly tactical and possibly low operational air superiority from the ground, they're going to strip from us our traditional enablers for the joint force, both on the ISR side, as well as from what has enabled us to conduct maneuver, which is close air support and arguably air interdiction. So to the degree that they're able to do that, when and where and for how long, that's an open question, but clearly they have created systems to both protect their ISR strike systems and with their IADs. And remember that their ground systems are also there to protect their ISR strike and their IADs, as well as to capitalize on any gains and conditions that their ISR strike systems can set, especially in a close area and the tactical support area. So I think that's important to see the interrelationship between the systems here. And then, of course, there's a longer information warfare effort that is tied in here, and this is to include the cyber and the information, as well as some of the space attacks. But again, the goal here for a limited strategic campaign, what we say in the paper, is their fait accompli campaign, that they can achieve their campaign objectives before partners and allies can sufficiently respond, is to separate the joint force in time so we can't respond adequately, that they can separate us tactically so that they can achieve their military objectives, set the defense, and start to consolidate gains, and now force the U.S. and partners to make a very important strategic decision. And as you know, for many of us, that the cost, as General Odom says, the cost of retaking lost ground and lost terrain and lost populations is going to be exponentially higher than if we held it in the first place. But that's what their systems are designed to do. Next slide. So many of you are familiar with the 5 problems the multi-domain battle must solve. Again, back to the battlefield framework and time on the left, and one that we spent a lot of attention on lately, and what we will in our upcoming war games, is really how do we defeat, deter, and turn denied space into contested spaces, short of armed conflict, below armed conflict. Problems 2, 3, and 4 are the problems that we are traditionally have been focused on, especially problems 4 and 3. But these are largely problems that you must prepare for before armed conflict in order to win an armed conflict. You have to prepare the environment, you have to exercise, you have to organize, you have to train, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then obviously the other one that we spend probably too little time on, and I would argue that the concept at this point does not spend sufficient time on, is the post-conflict competition. And the demarcation between the two that I think is not insignificant is that we anticipate that the transition from armed conflict to post-conflict competition, while it may be clear to us and that some agreement is signed or we reach some stasis in the fighting, the lethal fighting, is that it will still remain highly lethal, highly volatile, could return back to armed conflict, and will certainly be, in the non-lethal terms, very active. And so I think historically, and we placed 2 historical vignettes in here just to frame this, we see Korea, certainly in 1954 and beyond for sure. You could argue even the last 2 years of the Korean conflict, fighting element was largely one of, we were working to negotiation. We achieved the armistice, and it still remained highly violent for many, many, many years. Even, we'd argue that it remained probably very violent through the 50s and 60s. And then I'd say we came back to a period that is much more like problem 1 today. So as we work with our partners on the joint side, on the Air Force and the Marines, just sort of the, all cards facing out is a phrase, this is how I see it, this is Mike Runey's take, is that we see that the Air Force is very interested. They're interested in all of them, but they're very interested in problems 2 and 3. So base defense is an important challenge for them once armed conflict, we transition to armed conflict. And that's really gets at problem 2. How do we project power out of our bases, whether they're the bases in the United States or the bases abroad? And how do we protect them against a powerful and potent foe? Problem 3 is a traditional area that they operate in, and how do they get into that, acknowledging the IADS and other systems that they're going to challenge them. So we see great room for cooperation there, and there's ongoing work over the next months to get at that. The Marines are traditionally, I think, more focused with us in problem 4. And to some degree, they count on the Navy to help get them through problem 2. And they may or may not be really interested in problem 3, but really the close areas where they're focused. But there's good collaboration there. We've kept the Navy involved and informed of what we're doing. And I think more and more as we talk about it, that problem 1 we found with many people has become an area of increasing collaboration. So one of the things I would offer to this community, because you work with these, is the problems have actually helped us because, as you know, there are many versions of multi-domain battle that I would say as we've engaged the community. And so which multi-domain battle are you talking about? One of the ways we found is ask them if you said, which problem do you think we're working on that multi-domain battle has to solve? And what we found is that just about everybody could find 1 or 2 or more problems that say, hey, this is what we're working on. So this is where we found that this framework is not just the framework, the battlefield framework, but the problems, both in time, place, and how we look at the problem set, has actually helped us to have discussions with a larger group of people that we're now starting to come together. And they acknowledge that, hey, we're working on a couple of problems, but we also know that the other people are working on other problems. The one unifier of all this is the U.S. Army acknowledges we got problems, and all 5 of these are our problems. And so I'd offer that as a tool that we found helpful as you're going forward and start to bring people into a collaborative environment. Last week I had the opportunity to pinch hit for General Dias at SMDC. And one of the things I talked to and offered up, and I trying to reflect what I've heard General Dias say and General Odom say, is if organizations can articulate how their solution set fits into a larger context or problem set, it's going to be much more helpful for all of us. I'd offer that this is one that you can use at this point. I think it's solid enough. We'll see here in the next month or two, but it seems to be standing over the last 5 months or so. But I think it's helpful. So what I want to do in the next couple of slides, the first two are in draft. General Odom hasn't approved them, but I think that they're helpful in illustrating the components of the solution. I want to take you through three. If you go to the next slide. So the first one we say is to calibrate force posture. And so on the right side, as you're looking at this chart, are their adversary systems, and as they're laid out in Chapter 2. And so we're now into Chapter 3 of the document. So referencing back to Chapter 2, these are the adversary systems. And what we say is, in order to address those 5 problems that we have just presented, is that we must apply the components of solutions in different ways in different places to get at those 5 problems. But to understand what calibrate force posture gets at, is I want to take you across the top. And what we acknowledge right now from the intelligence, space, and cyber communities in particular is that you're in contact right now, all the time. And we have reach-back capability. It doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot where you are. I mean, at some point it does. But that you are already in the force posture mix. The reason it's dotted is we have a hard time quantifying that effect. So when we start to do analysis and go, what does that effect have, and how much will the enemy be able to, or the adversary be able to contest you, and we'll struggle with that, but I'll come back to that. But the reason we put you in front, right up sort of against that adversary, is that you're already in contact and acting, especially in the competition. The next is some balance of partner forces and capabilities in the green box, and what we have forward positioned. And what I want to clarify here, and it's in the document, but it's important, especially for those of us like myself who are traditionally thinking that we have permanently forward stationed forces. The concept expands the idea of U.S. forward positioned forces to include not only permanently stationed forces, but rotational forces, pre-position equipment and stocks, and exercises, and it even goes beyond that. So what we're trying to do is open this aperture, because of the feedback we got between 0.5 and 0.6 was we cannot box in our policymakers as saying we must have forward position forces. At the same time, and you can see across the top here, is that there's risk of not having some capabilities forward positioned, either permanently or they could get there very rapidly. And so this is the tension of what the calibration means, this active verb of calibrating here. It also acknowledges that we need to be able to supplement and complement what our partners are doing. And so when we talk to the soft community and we talk to those who are doing the partnership and exercising, and when our allies are developing their own capability sets, and we're looking out to 2030 and 2040 time frame, that it's important for us as we look at what our adversaries are doing to work with our allies and partners and figure out what needs to be forward postured and what capabilities do our partners bring. And the concept attempts to get at that. There's some things our allies and partners will be able to do we will have a very, very hard time doing, and we must acknowledge that and find ways to leverage that. So that forward position, I think the one that most people want to talk about is this forward position forces, or what are those? And what we certainly say is, how do those forward position forces leverage to the right the intangibles? How do they cooperate with the partner forces and capabilities? And how do they potentially receive expeditionary forces? And so it is dynamic. It's going to change what that calibration ought to be, based on theater, based on threat, based on, obviously, what the political leaders will authorize us to do. But I think the notion is, that I'd put is emphasize on calibrate. And you can see that the tasks of those calibrated force posture forces, friendly, partner, and U.S. joint forces, are a bit different in each action, both competition, below-armed conflict, and post-conflict. An important piece here, though, and you can see in that blue box in the center, is this notion that whatever is forward postured must be able to immediately receive expeditionary forces, must be able to turn a denied space into a contested space. The notion and the concept is we must have sufficient capability already inside of the A2AD envelope so we don't have to fight into it to gain access, that we're already there and we can contest and start to flow forces in. As I've worked with the community, I would say that our biggest challenge so far conceptually and moving into the physics of this is how do we look at expeditionary forces? And one of the things in the concept we say is that these forces must be able to conduct expeditionary maneuver from strategic and operational distances within days, not months. And so the implications to readiness are huge. The implications to the active component and reserve component are very significant. What those ought to be, the concept does not say, nor should it. That requires further study, and those are decisions beyond the scope of the concept. But what we're saying and the argument we're making here is if you look at what the adversary is doing in these, again, back to competition, conflict, and post-armed conflict competition, and the way they've set their systems and the way they're approaching this warfare, is that we have to change how we're thinking about expeditionary maneuver, and it's going to drive us to other things. That's the argument, and why we need to calibrate force posture and think about it differently. I think the key aspect here is time. When Lieutenant General Holder was working with the group out of Leavenworth last month, one of the pieces he gave us as a takeaway was he said, ladies and gentlemen, one of the things I'm hearing that's very different than what I've heard in the past is a requirement for speed of action in your concept. I thought it was helpful, and I think that gets to the notion of action over distances and time that we're trying to capture here. So go to the next slide. The next component of this solution is the employment of resilient formations. Again, this is a draft slide, not approved, but what it's trying to get at are really 4 ideas in different places, and resiliency will be emphasized in different places. The concept emphasizes resiliency in at least 4 ways. The first way is that these forces must be sufficiently resilient to conduct the expeditionary maneuver and immediately begin to operate and fight. That's different. So for example, a unit of whatever size, probably pretty small based on our current capabilities and even some of our projected capabilities, must be able to get on whatever's going to transport it forward, be already able to be connected into the network, already have their mission orders sufficiently on board that they can conduct planning, they can immediately hit the ground and begin to maneuver right away, both to survive, because they're going to be disrupted in movement and going to be attacked, and be able to start to take action both to survive and to both maintain whatever initiative they have and build on further initiative. There's an element of resilience in that. That has clear implications to the next 3. The first is mission command. So the notion that mission command, the philosophy, has not changed. I think the demand for our ability in the United States Army in particular, I think the Marines would talk about in the maneuver mindset, of maneuver philosophy that the Marines have, which is very similar to our mission command philosophy, is we must be able to execute it. The demand to be able to implement or exercise this mission command or realize it, as General Wesley talks about it, is increased, not decreased in this environment. And so you'll see in a second, I'll set this up. We had a question the other day. It was a really good one. It could be a tendency here to say, hey, we need more control, not less control. That in order to really work through all the domains, we need to slow things down and set up. So the question was, are you trying to create, and please don't take any offense, depending on your country of origin, you're trying to create Montgomerys or Guderians? And so there are 2 different approaches to generalship that for different reasons that they took. And so the point here is, I think we're definitely saying that we think the Guderian mindset, at least the one that I have, is the one where we're going toward, Montgomery, at least in the American mindset, the way I taught it at West Point was a much more methodical approach, but very effective, but had the benefit of time. So that was unscripted, so again, I hope that doesn't offend anybody here, but just as a mental model and a construct. So this mission command, regardless of where we are on the OE here, is pretty important and central. The other area is on. So let me back up to mission command for a second. So on mission command, so that's the philosophy, but we also acknowledge that the networks will be challenged and in some cases denied. So whatever the networks are, to enable this to our systems to operate must be sufficiently resilient to tolerate the disruption and the denial, and then be able to reestablish the network so that we continue to operate and seize initiative. The second piece that I would say, the second element here is this notion of protection. And protection is going to look a little different depending on where you are. And so, again, physical protection and how it may manifest itself differently. If you're at an air base or you're at an aviation FARP that's in the tactical support area, it's going to look different than if you're a cavalry unit up in the close area trying to penetrate into the deep maneuver area. It's going to look a bit different. But this notion of protection, that could be active and it could be passive. And it could be lethal and non-lethal. And what that looks like, we're leaving open. This is why the O&Os become particularly important, because we think as we start to talk to the centers of excellence that the O&Os are going to need to amplify and emphasize those elements of where protection shows up. And the last one, and the real challenge that we're dealing with, is sustainment. And as you know, that the movement and maneuver functional concept puts the demand signal is up to 7 days of semi-independent operations. As you know, we're still struggling very much with how to do that. And one area that we've seen is that the demand for Class 5 in particular is not going down, it's probably going up, just sort of in the aggregate. All other things being equal, is that this is going to be a more lethal, very sharp, very violent, and if you're going to prepare the environment appropriately, you're going to need to pre-stock maybe more ammunition than you may think. And so that's a real challenge for our sustainers. And so one of the things that we're seeing as we move forward is that we have to think about different ways to get at the logistical challenge. This is where our partners, I think, can help, what we can get forward positioned. This and so many other initiatives that our community is looking at, specifically on Class 3, Class 5, Class 1. Some of those things are just incredibly bulky and very difficult to manage, especially if we have to move them in short time periods. And so I want to highlight here a little bit on the 3 boxes and why these will manifest themselves a little bit differently. Is that I would say, for example, if elements that are moving from left to right out of the strategic support area, the mission command notion of resilience is going to, as I talked about earlier, is going to be probably, at least initially, right up front. They have to know when they get on those transport systems, whatever they are in the future, and they're moving rapidly within hours into a very contested and lethal environment, that they can operate immediately. JRSOI, as we have, as I thought about in my career, is no longer sufficient. We have to change this mindset. That's one. Those areas in the tactical support area, I think in terms of protection, both for themselves and for those others that they're enabling, for example, ports, bases, locks, are going to have to look different. They're not going to protect themselves 360 degrees, lethal, non-lethally. They're going to have to protect these elements that are attacking them. They're going to have to present to the adversary the real challenge that, am I really at this base or am I at another base? So we're going to have to pose some dilemmas in these areas. Part of protection is to create a decision dilemma, choice, for the adversary about where to target. One of the things we say in the systems, again, whether it's China, Russia, or someone else, is they may be able to range that far, they may be able to hit it, but they do not have an inordinate supply of those exquisite systems. They do have their own magazine depth. And one of the ways that you gain protection in those operational and tactical support areas is not just by physical protection or the ability to engage incoming type systems, again, lethally or non-lethally, but you can also, I call it spread the defense a bit and force that adversary to make choices. And then I think and certainly in the close and deep maneuver area, the element of resilience here gets to obviously more of the physical protection of what does that look like, to be able to take a hit and sustain the initiative, how to evacuate our casualties and sustain those, and then how to set the conditions logistically in ways that we aren't traditionally thinking about. And so the one that I ran into recently that I just offer as an exemplar is I think that as I've talked to the community is that we think of maneuver forces and support forces that have to push log forward. One point that General Odom often makes is we actually have the greatest freedom of action while we compete to prepare the environment. And so one of the important things here in the concept is this is not a concept that says we are marching to bring about regime change deep into an enemy's territory. That may be this, again, this is about staying in competition and then returning to competition as it was, and basically moving back into, if required, into friendly territory, what we call the deep maneuver area. So why wouldn't we prepare the deep maneuver area logistically well ahead of time to prepare us for that return into that area? There's high risk with that. I acknowledge that. But that also gets the logisticians out of the mindset is I've got to push the log pack forward and set the environment with that. We talked to our SOF partners, and they said, hey, we plan on staying behind a bit with partner SOF and partner forces who are going to be fighting still in the opening days of this conflict. We can help you target. We can help you link up. We can help you get those logistics packages. And what I'm saying is that when I talk to people, we haven't thought about, I don't think we fully explored that. I think we need to test it. We need to war game that out. But I think it's, when I talk to the logisticians, they think it starts to, they don't buy it yet. I won't say that. But I think it challenges our conclusion that we have to always push forward onto something that's moving forward, and how challenging that could be. I'm not saying we won't need to do that, but I'm saying that I think we need to think about it a bit differently. So that's how resilience may look differently in different places. Go to the next slide. The last component of the solution is the convergence of capabilities. Again, in Chapter 3. Some of you have seen an earlier version of this slide. And it's the first big idea that's a bit different. So General Perkins often talks about that our integrated federated solution of bringing the joint force together is no longer sufficient. And we talked about what the adversary has done both on the battlefield and its ability to converge its capabilities. And what we're saying is we have to be able to converge capabilities. And this is a top-down, pre-designed approach for the joint force, to include the Army, of how we're going to converge capabilities. But we don't just converge capabilities, or as I think General Perkins says, we don't multi-domain to multi-domain. There's a purpose to it, and you can read that across the top. And so it's to create those physical, virtual, and cognitive windows of advantage. And the window is both in time and space, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. And the important thing is to enable maneuver, but not just to enable maneuver for maneuver's sake, but it's to do at least three things. The first is to pose those dilemmas to our adversaries and enemies. The second is that we have to develop and exploit our own commander's options. So this may not be threat-focused, it may be terrain-focused, or a specific objective, for example, cyber, but it's to create options for our blue forces. And the last one is this notion that we're actually looking at how do we take apart the threat systems. Because our argument is that if you can combine these windows, not just one, but a series of them, and you have multiple pathways through there, is that really the aim of this is to defeat the threat's campaign plan and enable ours. And General Odom added, sort of we're working this up to the last, wanted to make sure we captured it, and I want to emphasize this last point, is look at the bottom, we probably move this to the top, is while we typically think about this a conflict period, we sort of those, it's planner types, we kind of understand that this, you're always working on your operational design and operational campaign plan. It's also while we're competing, that we need to be able to do this and create these windows of advantage and maneuver, especially in the virtual and cognitive with some physical supporting, so we always remain in the competition period on terms favorable to us. And at one point we thought about putting a big green box on the lower left under competition below armed conflict, because that's where we want to end up staying. But we are prepared to do this when we go to fight in the armed conflict, and then obviously we're doing this in the post-conflict period. And I mentioned this notion of time. So as you look about this, one of the reasons why we think the windows of advantage idea is really important is because how do we arrange action in time, space, and purpose? I mean, this is not new to us in here, but in terms of multi-domain battle, what does this look like? And one of the factors we talk about, one thing we think is most different is this notion of time, especially because the time elements of all the domains is different, right? So example is that the cyber tools and cyber weapons may take a long time to develop. So whoever developed Olympic Games, those of you familiar with Olympic Games, how long did that take to prepare? A very long time. Get placement and access, a long time. Do we have guarantee of that access? So that notion of preparation that's an example of a long one. Some others could be within a few hours, or if you're Air Force, an ATO cycle, maybe, or the future ATO cycle, maybe even shortened. So how long does it take to plan and execute that with a staff? That's a different element of time. Are they sufficiently trained? Do they have experience doing this across domains? How long does that window stay open? Or how long does that capability remain available to the commander who will choose whether or not to open that window or not, because some things are not available all the time. And this notion of reset, some things, for example, are if we're going to open a window to conduct expeditionary maneuver from the operational support area to the tactical support area forward, such as an aviation strike package with cyber and EW to support it, how long does it take to reset that element so that we can cycle it back again? And if you take the whole system, that's the cycle time. So if you're going to cycle through the whole thing, how long does that take? So the spaces we've talked about in the framework. And one of the things we got back from the community is, what are the purposes? So again, create windows of advantage to do what? So these are just things that we've come up with so far. So some of those windows may apply and the purpose of the window on that list on the right. So the Maneuver Center in particular said this may be particularly helpful to us if, hey, this is a window to gain access. This is a window to exploit. This is a window to defend. And so this notion of convergence of what this looks like is significant. The feedback we've gotten is, okay, Runey, how does this really work? So I think it's 17.2, so I'm looking at Wayne Grimmie. I'm converting. I think one of the things that Leavenworth is planning on doing, and the folks out there is actually hosting some type of meeting to start to figure out what this might look like. Carl, I'm looking at you just because we're red legs by training. They're looking at the targeting meeting, and basically can they use the targeting meeting and evolve that? So I just want to let you know, people are looking at how to make this and operationalize convergence. But one of the things we've come to the conclusion with, and I'm looking at Bill Rittenhouse, is that where the Navy, so our general approach or experience has been that the Navy and Air Force will generally start centralized for the reasons of a lot of their systems. We tend to be more decentralized and centralized when we need to be. But convergence requires at least some initial centralization and decision. And what we think, this is our hypothesis, is that there'll actually be fewer windows of advantage at the operational level than we might expect. So the commander's going to have to choose how and when to employ those capabilities to get those windows to enable the achievement of the campaign plan. So if you go to the next slide, most of Chapter 3, which is the bulk of this document, really starts to break these three out. So this is what we have to be able to do. These are the tasks that we think we have to be able to do in order to execute multi-domain battle. So as we go into Quick Look 3 next week, Chris Stoles and Ed Werkheiser are going down, and they're going to help prep and brief this out in support of what Des Bailey and Mike Stone and the crew are doing down there. UC 17.2 is coming up. We're going to start to expand on that. HTAF, I forget what number we're on, work we're doing, but the HTAF series. So know that we're exploring and how this looks at some of the other joint wargaming that we're doing. What I want to do here is I want to switch. Again, this is draft, but I want to illustrate to you. I'm looking at time. Got about 10 minutes, I guess. So I just want to lay out some visuals that if we get okay from General Odom to release, but it starts to lay this out. Go to the next slide deck. And so one of the things that we were challenged with point 6 was try to draw this out. And so what we've done here with some great graphical artists knows the draft, and we'll send this out, is we've tried to take the concept, and this is an illustration that I'll orient you to broadly here in a second, and say, what might this look like? And so the key thing here is you've got the enemy or adversary homeland up here, you've got the U.S. homeland here, you've got a continent, and you've got an ocean, and you've got the littorals here. So just roughly. So what we're saying is we're trying to build this concept that it could be effective on a continental landmass as well in the littoral system with an ocean, and this is a big ocean. So just we've changed the perspective here. And so what you can see here on the top is the battlefield framework. Now some of it is obviously nonlinear. Some of it may be more linear. We'll probably change that a little bit. The whole point is it morphs depending on what the commander needs it to do, right? To start to organize this or to illustrate what the adversary is doing and what we may need to do. Should that be the operating framework that they use to conduct the campaign? We're not making that supposition, right, or presupposing that. We're saying that this is helpful to see what's happening. So down to the legend, so a couple things that we're seeing. So one critique we had is, hey, there's not enough urban in this. one of the things when we start looking at the whole scope of this is urban is a subset of the larger campaign, which includes capitals of the U.S. adversary and our partners and allies, and cities throughout. So we have key ports down here. You can see an adversary port here, another port here. You got airfields here. You got other airfields around. And obviously you have, so key infrastructure that would enable that. The other piece I want to identify here, you see in blue, you see these E's. You see them showing up here, here. You see them showing up actually out in here. Those are the expeditionary advanced basing. So the Navy and Marines are particularly started talking, and Air Force is talking about how to do distributed operations. And so we've adopted that. So this is pretty important here. Some of them are active, some of them are inactive. Some of them are false, some of them are actual. And so how we portray that is important, especially in the competition below armed conflict. But one of the things we're showing here are all the red systems. And the reason I bring up the expeditionary advanced basing and the logistics to support that, which you can start to see, is that the threat systems are very active while competing. And they're listed by system as they are in the concept. So unconventional warfare, information warfare, cyber, all the way down. And they're represented here. Are they Air Force? Are they Navy? Doesn't matter. We're just identifying systems. Similarly, you'll start to see blue showing up. We've given a few notional, mostly on our expeditionary basing and logistics prep here. In our exercise regime, we started to talk about what the adversary is seeing in the competition period as they're watching us conduct exercises through here. So again, that's the rough orientation and what you can see what the adversary is doing to prepare the environment, conduct reconnaissance, conduct information warfare. Again, the goal is separating us politically. And these are the snap drills. Notice the dotted lines don't cross the international boundary, which is right here. Okay, they're not attacking, but they could. And so we're indicating that both on ground and in the maritime environment. Next slide. So this is how we're responding in the competition. This is what we say we ought to be doing in a very cohesive and consolidated way. Across all the domains, so space and cyber are represented both like CNS down here near a homeland capital. That's where it emanates from or is authorized from. And you can see illustratively where it might have an effect. That's all we're saying. We're not saying what effect it has, how long it has. We're just saying illustratively that they're in the mix. Again, I talked about the exercise paths into expeditionary advanced basing. We can demonstrate that we can rapidly conduct that expeditionary maneuver. We're also saying we can very rapidly counter anything, and we're demonstrating that, again, dashed lines through exercises with our systems here. We're leveraging that preparation of the environment. We've got unconventional warfare elements, both blue and green, that are working forward and setting up targeting arrays that will be resilient sufficiently that if and when an adversary ever chose to move into those areas, they would face a risk of being targeted even though we may or may not have physical presence in that area. Preparing the environment. We also acknowledge that at some point we may want to have the option, our senior leaders may want to have the option of moving into adversary homeland territory. We're saying we'll be prepared to do that. We're not saying we will. That's not a choice that a Joint Force commander gets to make. But as we talk to our unconventional warfare, the soft community, as they said, that's probably something we need to indicate that we would be prepared to plan to do. There will be plans on the shelf to do that. So whether we're working over the continent or working through a maritime environment, we're exercising that. We're preparing those advanced spaces. We're conducting an information campaign to counter what you just saw in the prior slide, with our partners, even in our own homeland. Notice there are no green forces on here. That's meant for a reason, because blue is friendly. So back to calibrated force posture. How much is friendly? How much is U.S.? Don't know. That's calibrated, but illustratively, that's what we're trying to show. How much is where's the Air Force on here, Runey? Where's the Navy? Well, I'd say a couple things. That's a maneuver element. That's a blue maneuver element here. That's a blue maneuver element. It's on the maritime. It could be subsurface. It could be surface. The concept just says joint forces and partners. Again, back to what does the calibrated force posture look like? I don't know. I mean, I think that's largely what your team helps us, work through and we war game out. So again, illustrating what's happening here. And remember, the goal for the friendly forces here is to remain in the competition period on ever more favorable terms for friendly forces and protect our national interests. And so what you have here is, hey, what are our key tasks? And basically a synopsis of what the concept says this is going to play out. And these numbers here are showing up in here, sort of illustrating and pointing to that. Next slide. So what does this look like in armed conflict? What is the adversary attempting to do? Well, this is I think I'm losing power here. But this red line right here is where their limit of their fait accompli, or their strategic campaign objectives are. So they're going to go try to set that defense as rapidly as possible. You can see those red lines have now turned bold red. They've pushed their initial IADs out, started to deny it to here. Their fires and strike systems are reaching all the way down here and much more active. And obviously their cyber, some of their other unconventional warfare is reaching all the way from the U.S. homeland all the way back, as we described in those systems. And so you can see the red activity being much more aggressive, not only on continent, but also in the maritime, to seize those objectives and consolidate those gains. Next slide. But we're not responding to that, so just imagine these two slides are happening simultaneously. All right, so this is not a action, reaction, counteraction. The notion here is we do not give up the initiative ever while competing or fighting, is that those forces that are forward, that forward posture forces, there are elements that are immediately countering. Do they have sufficient capability to defeat those attacking forces? Probably not. But remember, while they're trying to separate our timelines, we're also trying to extend their timelines. By extending their timelines, we start to gain some freedom of action at the operational strategic level to create more options for our strategic leaders and for other forces to start to move. Inside of the close tactical support and operational support areas, U.S. forces and partners that are already in theater and capabilities, not just forces because some of those are reach back, are able to rapidly start to move forward. Rapidly, within hours, days, certainly within the short end of weeks, but certainly not months. They'll be much more rapid than that. And then there's certain elements that are coming forward, again, whether they're cyber, whether they're space, information, obviously, as the military employs that element of national power, and some forces moving forward. Again, that could be air power, global strike systems, it could be maritime strike systems, other things that are taking off and being recovered inside of the United States or within theater. And what those are, we don't say. But I think this notion that I want to make sure you walk out of here is we are not surrendering the initiative at any time. It will be a contested initiative. And what we're saying is we have to set up those systems, going back to the art and science of the components of the solution. And to close out here is we must apply those at different places at different times with our partners and with the joint force in order to maintain that initiative, to protect the alliances, to further our interests while competing, while fighting, and then while competing again. So to close out, I sort of like to say by the numbers, the 4 ways the operating environment has changed, and the 4 ways the adversary has expanded the battlefield. The 5 problems multi-domain battle must solve. 3 components of the solution applied to those 5 problems in different ways, different places. The 2 new big ideas are convergence and competing, and how we do that. And the one big challenge for us that we have to figure out is how to operate in the time requirements that multi-domain battle demands of us. So I'll pause there. I recognize we're almost out of time. But that's the summary of the 0.7. Again, I need any feedback by 31 August. If you could send it to me, Chris Stoles, and Ed Werkheiser over here. But sir, any questions or comments?
No, I don't, we're short on time here, but no, appreciate you coming down and providing this update for everyone. I think, reading the document's one thing, having someone to kind of walk you through some of these ideas is extremely helpful, and I think it's only going to enrich the feedback that we can give to you.
Thanks, sir. Anybody else? Any questions? I will hang around for, I got about 5 or 10 minutes. I have I think a 12 o'clock with the COEs. Sir, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.